NATO was formed in 1949 at the height of or actually at the beginning of the Cold War, shortly after World War II, when there was two huge military blocs, the Western Alliance and the Soviet Alliance, and then later on the Warsaw Pact against the NATO Pact. And there was a very real, very strong and powerful threat from the East to the West. In that environment, the Western nations came together in complete unanimity. Everybody was lockstep for decades over the recognized threat from the Soviet Union, which was a literal existential threat on both the conventional and nuclear levels against NATO. And that helped, that unanimity and that common purpose, that laser focused requirement that all of them had for their collective security, kept the alliance the most remarkable alliance in the history of the world. Today, however, things are a little different. Now then, there is a lot of fracturing going on within NATO, although you wouldn't know it by talking to some, because a lot of people like to keep on with a lot of this fiction we keep talking about in several areas here on this show, to where the words coming out of people's mouth are one thing and the realities on the ground are, well, rather different. And we're going to have somebody from Europe join us live from London today. We actually have back with us Ian Puddick. Ian, welcome. He's a businessman from London, very well connected, and it has his ear to the ground there. It can really help us untangle some of this stuff. Ian, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, thank you, Colonel. Thank you so much for inviting me back.
Always definitely our pleasure to have you on, because, you know, you and I off screen and have had lots of conversations. I've always been impressed with your grasp of, you know, kind of what's real going on, your recognition of what's happening on the ground, especially in the UK and in Europe generally. So I couldn't think of anybody better to have on today.
Thank you.
Do have to ask though, what's your location there? It looks like you have some sort of nuclear spy based stuff in the background. What's all that about?
Some might call it that. So yeah, no, so in London, I run a plumbing company and also separately a gin, whiskey and rum distillery. I mean, they couldn't be more different. But
they all have pipes, so I think there is some connection.
Well, absolutely. And my plumbers make the gin, the whiskey and the rum. And I have to say, I said to Prince Charles, he's the king now, but I did say to Prince Charles once when we did a tasting with him, he said how fantastic our gin was, because we do supply Buckingham Palace. And he turned around and he said how good it was. And I said, if you knew the plumbers that made it, you wouldn't drink it, sir. And he went, I hope I don't meet them.
Well, let's hope they don't ever get their pipes crossed. That would be a problem. But
yeah, no comment. No comment.
Very nice. Very nice. That's awesome. Yeah, I'm gonna have to come over and taste some of your wares one of these days.
You'll be very welcome.
Seeing you in person the next time I get there. Well, let's just jump right in here, Ian, because there are actually, and even frankly, when you talk about the words, there's a lot of division growing between some of the EU members. And of course, the US and the UK have always been probably the two that are, you know, both, tooth and mouth kind of thing. We're always together. And that's the case right now. But first of all, let's start off with really the big bombshell over the last week or two, and that is French President Emmanuel Macron, who's saying, hey, we may not have any red lines. We may send troops into Ukraine. A couple of days ago, big press conference he had with a couple of presenters in France. He said this:
Europe and the security of the French are at stake over there. And these are our vital interests. You're using a term that has particular connotations. I say security.
And you yourself have used the term existential threat.
But
that means it's our very existence that's at stake in the
Say
game.
it and I assume it. We've already suffered the consequences of this war in our daily lives. We've already suffered these attacks. Many of our hospitals have already suffered days and days of dysfunction due to Russian aggression. We've already suffered the consequences in Europe. The price of gas, the situation of our economy, the cost of cereals, the economic upheavals that have followed are the consequence of this war launched by Russia.
Now, first of all, I think it's required to say that the presenter did try to nail him in there, because he said an existential threat. Now, an existential threat by definition means your literal physical existence is at stake if things go in a bad direction.
Absolutely.
But then the details that he gave her were more like challenges or difficulties. Well, the price of gas, some of the cereals and whatnot. And then it's hard to get past the fact that all of those are a problem because of the sanctions that the West put on Russia on those very areas. He kind of left that part out there. But just first of all, I want you to talk about a little bit about what some people are saying, because I know that you and I have had conversations where there are some people in the UK that are and elsewhere in Europe that are buying this existential claim.
Yes, absolutely.
But is it that way with everybody?
Well, not with everybody, but obviously you've got the mainstream media that parrot the official government narrative. But if you think about it logically, just common sense, you don't have to be particularly bright. Just common sense, apply some critical thinking. So the head of MI6 told Sky News a few months ago, just before Christmas actually, that Ukraine was winning and Ukraine had taken back more land than Russia had taken. So Ukraine's winning, great. And by the way, can I just make this really clear? I'm anti-war. I'm anti this war. Should Russia have invaded? No. Do I agree with it? Of course not. But I'm just giving my analysis from what I know and from the people that I speak to that you're aware of what the real feedback is. So Ukraine's winning, Russia's losing, Ukraine's gaining more ground back than Russia had taken. And then we're told that Russia's weak. Well, it was in mainstream media for ages that Russia was buying in washing machines so that they could take the chips out of washing machines to put them in missiles. So we know Russia's really weak, but when it suits the media and obviously the powers that be, which is where the media gets its narrative from, Russia's all powerful and they're going to take over the whole of Europe. Well, they can't have it both ways. They can't say Russia's really weak and awful and rubbish.
Right.
But
right.
they're a threat to everybody. It's nonsense. It's nonsense.
Yeah, I've seen that a lot. That it depends on which way you want to go and which emotions they want to tag to. Because on the one hand, Russia's coming for us all if we don't stop him right here, and then the other one is like those terrible Russians. They can't even move beyond. They can't even take Kiev. They had to get kicked back. And
absolutely,
like, hang on. So wait a minute. Those don't go together. But others don't seem to blink on that. And part of the reason, Ian, is because we got to come back to our side of the pond this time. We're as much as it is fault for that as anybody else, because earlier this very day, just hours ago, the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, was in Germany meeting with a group of 50 nations trying to bring more support to Ukraine. And he says, wow, this is what was the phrase he uses here? The great cause of our time. Check this out.
The Czech Republic recently procured 800,000 urgently needed artillery shells. Germany, France, Denmark, and Sweden have each recently announced important new military aid packages. We will all be less secure if Putin gets his way, and we will all be less secure in a lawless, violent world where dictators can redraw borders by force, wipe countries off the map, and rebuild their old empires. So Ukraine's battle remains one of the great causes of our time. And the Ukrainian people do not have a day to waste, and neither do we.
And right after that, then I think to try to match what Macron had been saying about this is a Europe thing and NATO is unified, he shows his incredible mastery of geography and the ability to recall the names of places when he said this.
I'm grateful to Denmark, Estonia, France, Germany, Iceland, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, and the UK for steering the capability coalitions. We'll keep working together with all of the capability coalitions to help Ukraine build a formidable force for the future, and we won't let up. Ukraine's struggle for freedom matters to us all. Putin will not stop at Ukraine. But as President Biden has said, Ukraine can stop Putin if we stand with Ukraine and provide the weapons that it needs to defend itself. Ukraine's survival is on the line, and all of our security is on the line.
Ian, how's that part playing? That the last thing he said there, all of our security, all that long list of people that he just mentioned, kind of what we were just talking about, that they're coming for us. Do people buy that on the street that you talk to?
Yeah, largely. So I'm talking about everyday people, just normal working people. Generally believe, they live busy lives. They catch bits of news on the radio, on TV. So, you know, they carry on with their lives, which are far more important than listening to what's going on elsewhere. And that's what they're fed: newspapers, radio, TV. People in the Ministry of Defence that I talk to, the only way I can describe it is it's a religion. So there are absolutely firm believers. Russia is bad. We're all good. It's a nice, easy narrative. Works, fits the agenda. And there are people there that are aware that this is not a black and white situation. They're doing their job, and you know that's what they do. So that's to be expected. But they're aware that this is not a black and white situation, which is what most of the public largely believe, if that makes sense.
It does. And to what extent, if anyone even goes down the rabbit hole of thinking through this kind of stuff, like I said at the outset here, during the Cold War, and you're talking right after World War II, there was a clear and present literal existential threat coming from the East. And it was no kidding, both conventional and nuclear, and everyone was aware of that. Absolutely. But now then, since the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s and all the things that have passed and transcribed in that, is it a case to where regular people are still thinking Russia equals the Soviet Union, and so the threat is the same? Or do they stop to recognize that Russia is a shell of what the Soviet Union was at the time? And so maybe they'll question whether there really is an existential threat. Or do they go that far down?
Well, I just think people don't know enough they're not educated enough or informed enough about what Russia is today. Russia is not the Soviet Union. You can debate it till kingdom come, but I think Colonel Schaefer says that there are thugs that are there running the country. There are what they call oligarch type people that run the business, but run the country. But it's not the Soviet Union. That may be true. I don't know. I mean, I've been to St. Petersburg. It's a modern. Russia is a modern country. If you look at Russia 30 years ago, once it had collapsed, if you watch documentaries about that country, it was on its knees. Well, 30 years later, which is a very short period of time, by the way, it now has a huge industrial, precious metals, oil, gas. It's a big manufacturing base. So it's just come from nothing, really. It's come from I don't want to say a failed state, but a failed state where the state ran absolutely everything: the telephones, the sewers, the water, everything was run by the state. Now it's all private businesses. It is different, but people have long memories. People have long memories, and people in power, especially in this country, I mean, they still view Russia as the Soviet state. I told you? I think we had the conversation when I was talking to some RAF pilots, and these are. I'm 54. I'm a golden oldie. There were these guys were in their sort of young to mid 30s. These are RAF pilots. And we were having a drink, and we were talking. So this would have been in June 22, and we were talking about Russia, and they were telling me that they were flying over the Black Sea, and these missiles were coming. Literally, they called them shooting stars coming out the sea, and he said it was just an absolute. It was incredible. And they're coming. These are cruise missiles, Russian cruise missiles coming out of submarines, and they were saying, "Wow, I've never seen." And it wasn't like one or two. They were going on for ages. So there's not clearly a load of submarine. I have no idea how many missiles a submarine can hold, but I'm assuming for the period of time that they said to me, there must have been a number of submarines in the area firing all these missiles out. And then within 30 minutes, they were saying Russian soldiers are really poor equipped. They're demoralized. They haven't got a clue. They're poorly led. And one of them actually, and I'm not joking, these are intelligent guys. These aren't idiots. These are smart, intelligent guys that have just taken hook, line, and sinker, whatever they've been spoon-fed, and not thought and stopped and thought, hang on, does this really make sense? And they were saying that the Russian soldiers don't have shoes. They have their own. They come with their own shoes into a combat situation. And I said, well, that doesn't make sense. You were just saying that they've got all these cruise missiles. And he said, yeah, that's because they've spent all the money on cruise missiles. They've got no money for equipment. Yeah. I mean, you can see
and you know why? I mean, you're talking about some RAF pilots, and obviously I can trot out a number of military men in the United States who are the same kind of. Actually, I'm about to show you one here from a former admiral who's making the same kinds of arguments here. But what I think is part of the reason, which you've touched on a little bit, and it's definitely going on really commonly across the West, and that is this very carefully crafted narrative that all of the media is supposed to follow. And I'm going to show you here something from that Zelensky released. I want to say it was yesterday. It might have been this morning. I can't recall, but very frequently, because a U.S. senator, among other people, have gone there. Lindsey Graham is in Kiev, or was yesterday. And I'm going to show you this clip here where Zelensky's showing out he was meeting with those people and talk. But notice that this is not just a newsreel. This sounds, it's got a soundtrack in the back. It's like a movie. It's trying to generate emotion. Just watch this and check it out.
Thank you very much, Senator, and your team. Thanks for coming. That's a good signal for us, for Ukrainians. And of course, from the very beginning, let me to be thankful to the United States, to the people of your country, your bipartisan support, and to President, his administration. Thanks so much. Also, we are thankful for all this 2 years support from Congress of the United States. And now this is very challenging period for Ukraine and also in the United States. We wanted very much to hear what do you think about it, what do you think about support. So future support. So thanks, welcome.
We'll talk about all of the above, but before we say anything, I just admire what you and your people have been able to do for 2 years. I remember we were told he would fall in 4 weeks. We're still here, still fighting. Putin won in a landslide. You know why he got 87%? Because I guess he didn't want 88. That would look bad. So this is the 10th anniversary of the annexation of Crimea. So better days ahead for the people of Ukraine. And Putin will go down in history the way all the people like Putin go down in history. Just a matter of time.
I'm sorry. I just can't help but cringe and obviously laugh a little when I see this attempt to pull at the emotion strings. And there was the foreign minister, Kuleba, looking sad when Graham was talking about the 10th anniversary of Crimea and all of the things. You know, Putin has this massive support among his people, just won another 6-year term. You know, they still have an iron grip on Crimea. They're now advancing across every aspect of the front. And now there's news from the UK intelligence services that apparently there's a northern front about to open up by the Russians. So every way you want to look, the things are moving in the wrong direction. But everyone talks about, like, and you see he ended that with the inevitability of it's only a matter of time until Putin falls, even though there's no evidence of it.
No, absolutely. I mean, I don't know if it was me, but was there very gentle, calming music as the senator was speaking?
Yeah, there was some
perfect.
Piano. It's kind of
perfect.
Just relax. Everything's fine.
In a movie script.
Exactly.
You know, it was a movie script. I mean, it was the right music for the tone, for the message, to get you relaxed, to say it's just a matter of time, bear with us. And it's just nonsense. It's just nonsense. I mean, Russia's weak. They're losing. I mean, unfortunately, and I say this sadly and absolutely regrettably, Ukraine's lost, I think, over 500,000 men dead and injured. It's a generation of young men. And they're talking about more weapons. They need people. And if you said that 6 months ago, you're a Putin stooge and a Kremlin, you were following Kremlin lies and all of this kind of stuff. I get called that all the time, obviously. But the reality is, whatever that reality is, at some point will manifest itself, because the reality can't change. You can mask it and hide it and play around with it for as long as you can, but at some point the reality will manifest itself. And while that happens, while we play these games, young men are dying. And if you dare ask for peace talks, you're a weirdo. You're crazy. You're working for Putin because you want peace. It's nonsense. I've never known anything like it.
You know, and you mentioned there about the facts. Okay, this is out in I think it was Polish media this morning. Yeah, the former chief of the Polish general staff, so not just somebody, says that Ukraine's losses are estimated in the millions. not even just the hundreds of thousands. The country has no resources, no one to fight. The Ukrainians are losing this war. So this is obviously one of their staunchest allies, and Poland has been one of the most vociferous in saying, yes, we need to continue going on against Russia for understandable historical and geographic reasons, right? You know, with their next door neighbor and all that. But even one of the senior Polish officials is saying that there's just no manpower to do this. It doesn't matter how many more people you can try to mobilize. You're literally sending them to slaughter.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. They just need people. They just need people. And all that you asked me about Macron earlier, you know, why did he say there's an existential threat, which is just complete nonsense? Well, the good thing, you know, I'm not a politician, but the good thing, if you put your political hat on, you know, Macron can stand up now and say, I was the only person in Europe that was ready to fight Putin, take on the Russians, destroy them and all that kind of stuff. Because he knows it doesn't. It's easy to make a promise that you don't have to keep. So he can make these threats and, you know, stand strong and sound strong, because he doesn't have to do anything about it, because he's not going to be going to war. He's not going to be sending French soldiers. But afterwards, at some point, he can say, well, I was the only person. It's pathetic. It's absolutely
pathetic. And actually, that I think that there's probably some plausible, that's probably a plausible outcome or intent, because as we see, Europe is very far from unified. So while they're claiming this on the front, like, you know, Lloyd Austin is saying, yes, we are unified and we're all together in this. There's an existential threat. So says the Élysée Palace in Paris. But then you start looking at some of the other European leaders and not so much. Let's start with Viktor Orban.
My country, Hungary, is the lone star state of Europe.
There's no problem with so-called, Ukraine fatigue, for sure. We have Orban fatigue now.
I think there is a battle for the heart of the European Union and even for Western civilization itself. And I think sometimes the pressure that's put on Hungary is because it is within the West, it is within Europe, but it represents an alternative way, this more conservative approach, which is still very successful.
And then we have the Slovak leader, the new Slovak leader, who is derided by many in the West as a pro-Russian leader. He has a different view, but here's what he says about his country.
This is the Slovakia I would like to see, not run by amateurs without experience, so that we won't be dragged into misadventures, whether with migration or the military.
So now, you know, I'm going to show with probably one of the bigger disputes is between France and Germany. And I'll show you that in just a second. But on these two with Orban and the Slovak leader, if you go, those guys are both saying, we're not going to go to war with Russia. So not only are we not sending troops, we think the whole thing about this military adventurism is just not working, because apparently they didn't get the media memo or the movie from Kiev or whatever, but they're just not buying it. So to what extent, from your observation there, do people in the UK especially, or even throughout Europe, as you may have access to, when they see these guys, do they think, hey, maybe they're right, or do they think these guys are just out there and they're, you know, not being team players?
Yeah, with two answers to that question. So just the general public, man on the street, woman on the street, I think they would be perceived, because of the media, that they're not team players. You know, we might not be part of Europe anymore physically, because we were part of the EU, but now we've come out of that. But we're still part of Europe. We still trade with Europe. We still have close relations with Europe. So, you know, those countries are perceived as pro-Kremlin, pro-Putin, but they're sensible people. They Viktor Orban's politics are not my politics for sure, but he's a realist. You know, you saw his interview with Tucker Carlson. You know, should we go to war with Putin, with Russia? He laughed. He said, "Are you joking? You know, are you seriously asking me that? You know, it's a ridiculous question. Of course not." It's like me getting in a ring with Mike Tyson. There wouldn't be enough cups of tea to revive me. It's nonsense. It's just nonsense. It's just crazy.
And you know what? I think that this really is highlights that this is not 1949, to where everybody recognized a genuine existential threat. So now these guys, they're closer to Russia, physically closer, geographically. So if there was a threat, they should be more worried than France, Germany, or the UK. And yet you see they're not concerned at all. That should set off some questions in people's minds, like, wait, why aren't they worried?
But so just to answer your question in a roundabout way, 2 weeks ago, I was at a meeting. I was a casual. Anyway, I was with some guys from the MOD, and they were telling me that Lithuania is on the highest state of emergency alerts, waiting for Putin, for Russia to invade Lithuania. So I said, why? And they just said they got some intelligence from America, from the States. That's from you lot. I blame you for that. From the US, that they were on the front line and they're going to be one of the first when Russia invades, and they believe it. They don't. I have no idea. I have no contacts in Lithuania at all.
Yeah.
So if you ask me why they believe that, you'd have to ask somebody there. But it's. I mean, Colonel McGregor does say this enough, and I think he's absolutely right. We are largely all US vassals. So there's this political culture where let's pick a side. Do we want to work with the Americans or Putin? It's a rhetorical question. We know which side we want to work on. But unfortunately, it's all corrupted because it's not a battle between good and evil, and that's the narrative of the battle. There's a good side and a bad side. What side are you on? What side am I on? And unfortunately, that's how it's crafted, and that's how it works.
Well, look, I've got a great exposition of that to show right here. So first of all, I'm going to show you in just a second here a clip of Scholz from Germany, to where, in direct contradiction to what Macron said, he said he's not going to send any troops into Ukraine, and he's going to explain to you why. But then check out the response from the United States on the backside of that. Let's get first to Scholz.
It is excluded for me when it comes to long-range weapon systems. There's no point supplying any weapons that can only be used if German military members have to go to Ukraine to do that. This is a line in the sand for me as a German chancellor, which is why my position is very clear in this case. I think it is necessary that when we are supplying weapons, we ensure that there is no involvement of German soldiers in their use.
So now it's not just Orban and Fico, but now Scholz is also saying, I don't recognize a threat, and we're dang sure not going to send our troops in there or send some long-range missiles that could end up prompting a missile coming back in my direction. So he does not recognize the threat that much either. But instead of people starting to go, okay, now then there's a number of European states, a number of NATO countries that are not, buying into this narrative. We have him on this, his quotes on this show a lot. Former 3-star general, U.S. Army Europe Commander Ben Hodges, taking German Chancellor Scholz to task.
Nations do seem disjointed. And I think, to be candid, unfortunately, the German Bundeskanzler seems the one that is the most out of step with everybody else. It must be really painful for him to be having to do things he's doing now, providing aid to Ukraine, building up the Bundeswehr, different from what he ever imagined he would be doing when he was a younger politician. But it's essential. I mean, Germany, the most prosperous, richest country in Europe, the massive industrial capacity, has got to help guide. Otherwise, if Ukraine fails, we're going to be in a terrible conflict with Russia in Europe, and Germany is going to pay a massive price.
This is all going to come crumbling down because Ukraine is on a path to be defeated. But it's not just those states that are starting to see this out, because people are also starting to figure this out in some of the other countries. There's a piece out, and I believe European Politico this morning. It's talking about how there is a big problem throughout NATO of a brain drain where experienced soldiers are leaving the service because they're disgusted with what they see. You see, in the United States, we're having a huge problem getting people to even join the military because they see this stuff and they see that's nonsense. This what you guys are doing, you're like seeking a war, and there doesn't need to be any at all. So I think they're getting more and more out of step, and so there's cracks forming not just within NATO, but even within a NATO country where the foundation is starting to wobble, and in all of this is self-inflicted.
Absolutely, it's completely all self-inflicted. I mean, I think the US originally cited a report from the Rand Corporation about how weak Russia was, and some really tough, robust sanctions against Russia, and it would just crumble. And obviously that turned out to be absolute nonsense. And then they reviewed it some months later. I mean, it's just not, it's just crazy. I mean, who are these experts? In any field, whatever the field is, there are experts for one perspective and there are experts for the other. And obviously, I guess the people in the people in power will choose the experts that that tickle their ears, that say whatever they want.
Right answer, yeah.
But it's just nonsense. I mean, I'm not making this up. I mean, so NATO's I don't think it's their motto anymore. I'm sure they've quietly dropped it. But NATO's original motto was keep Russia out. And that's when it was the Soviet Union, and understandably so. And then keep Germany down. And there's a famous quote from Lord Ishmael, the Secretary General.
I remember that.
And now Germany's so Russia's out. Well, they're out on their own. They're trading with the rest of the world and not the EU. And Germany's deindustrializing. I mean, we spoke about this. I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago, one evening, with Alexander Bakuris, a mutual friend of ours. And neither of us were just completely baffled as to why Germany would deindustrialize. I mean, big German companies like VW, Miele, BASF, I think Germany's biggest chemical company, are opening plants in America because they need cheap energy and they can't get it. But they can get it, but they choose not to for political expediency. I mean, and Biden, forgive me for being rude about your president, but you wouldn't send him down the shops to buy a loaf of bread. And yet these countries are deindustrializing because they do what Biden says. I mean, when the Nord Stream blew up, I think Scholz was with him at the press conference. It's it beggars belief. It beggars belief.
Right, and especially when you had both Biden himself before the war started and Victoria Nuland, who recently left in disgrace, bragged that Nord Stream 2 will not survive if there's a war one way or the other. And apparently we had the other, is how it worked out, and why Germany remained silent is still somewhat baffling to this day.
But German media.
Right. Yeah,
German media should be banging on the door saying what is going on with our country, and they're not.
Yeah, and it's just really confusing. Now that is starting to happen a little bit in France because Macron doesn't have anything close to be a unified country, and lots of his political figure. In fact, he's only got like a 24% approval rating, and many other political parties and figures in France are pushing back hard against what he's doing here. But the reason why I say that this is a house of cards just waiting to fall is because not is it only going bad on the battlefield for Ukraine, and it's irreversibly so in my estimation, but there is no strategy for accomplishing this other than as long as it takes. That's as close as we come to wanting to do it. But you talk about industrial capacity. So we know from open source reporting that Russia went all out 24/7 with their military industrial complex, and they are now cranking in on a massive process across the board within their community, within their country, within their own supply chains to make artillery shells, refurbish tanks, even make jet planes, continue to make missiles, which everyone in the West said they would run out of several months into the war, and they still haven't. They continue to make all these things. And just look at the artillery shells. So according to most reports in the West, Russia will be able to produce about 4.5 million shells of 152 millimeter by the end of the year. The West is on pace to produce somewhere around 1.3 million shells. And the other day, Czech Republic alleges that they have found 800,000 shells scrounging around the world somewhere. So maybe that number will now be closer to 2 million. But you still have 4.5 million that Russia produces. And according to recent intelligence, the North Koreans have been accelerating their shipment, and it could be 2 or 3 million in addition to that. Those are ongoing processes here. What the Czech Republic and the U.S. is basically scrounging, but there's no plan to ever surpass Russia in those categories. They'll always be chasing them because Russia's continuing to expand as well. They're looking towards setting up a sustained long war. So any way you want to look at it, there's no rational path to victory for the Ukraine side. And so one has to ask the question, is there some thought somewhere that they would resort to nuclear weapons, or are they just blind to the fact that they're racing headlong towards a cliff that at some point will fall? Because the Ukraine army will at some point collapse. They can't literally go on forever just continuing to not lose.
Scary. I mean, it's scary territory. I mean, if you ask me personally, we've had this conversation. I've had this conversation with my friends. I call them friends. They are friends. If anyone was going to use a nuke, it will be Biden. It'll be Biden. Why would Russia detonate a small, and even a small nuclear explosion isn't small, just to put it in perspective. Why would Russia want nukes going off near their border, anywhere near them? It's just nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. You know, America, if Biden dropped a nuke over there somewhere, well, it's not going to affect you directly for some time, if that makes sense. So just, you know, it's just, you know, I'm not a military man, but just common sense says, you know, if we say that Russia's mad, bad, evil, wicked, all of that kind of stuff, would they want a nuke going off on their territory or near their territory? The answer's got to be no.
Yeah, I am certain. I was actually worried about nuclear escalation a lot in the opening rounds of this, but then things kind of settled down toward the end of 2022, and then Russia started going tactically. You know, they held the ground throughout 2023, and now they've started moving to the forward. Now, that's bad for Ukraine, but for the world, that's actually breathing a sigh of relief, because the only reason that Putin would use nuclear weapons is if his conventional forces started to be defeated. And he basically said that the other day on I want to say the 29th of February, where he said they would use nuclear weapons if Macron made good on his threat and Western NATO countries started fighting in Ukraine. Then he might escalate to that. So as long as we don't do something stupid, he's not going to. But the question I'm wondering is if none of that keeps happening, but then reality finally imposes itself on this global stage in Ukraine, just like it did in Afghanistan in August of 2021, when the spin finally was met, you know, crushed under reality, and we lost that war. If something similar could happen here, then what? What are we going to do then? Are we just, all this rhetoric we've been saying for, you know, 2.5, 3 years, by that time, we're just going to roll back and go home? Or are we going to risk escalation? That's my worry, that we escalate if their army collapses.
Well, I'll tell you what the escalation will be. So back in September, October last year, Britain talked to Germany about German troops and British troops going into Ukraine to push Russia out of Ukraine, not as part of NATO. This isn't a NATO operation. I mean, it would be, because they would be supplying all the weapons and all the bombs and all of the intelligence. But on paper, it's nothing to do with NATO. I have no idea how that conversation went, but I know it hasn't happened. So I'm assuming it wasn't good. Then there was a conversation about sending, again, German, British and French soldiers into Ukraine, not as part of NATO. So this is just British soldiers trying to help. And I do know that they said that they could put 40 to 60,000 soldiers throughout Ukraine, and they could push Russia out in 14 days, and they would have they would have air superiority. And the guy that told me that, I said, does that mean they, as long as Russia doesn't fire back, that they can put Russia out? Right. I mean, it's
holy cow.
I mean, it's desperation.
Wow.
I mean,
that's terrifying, Ian, if people believe that, because look, I fought in an armored fight, and I was in the 2nd Cavalry in Europe during the Cold War, to where we literally patrolled the east-west border. We did numerous field exercises against, you know, the Soviet doctrine, which is what Russia still primarily uses. And even in an offensive operation, the Russians, you know, are very, very formidable, and certainly in the defense, which they have shown to be expert, you know, probably better than what we've done, because they now have experience of doing it. The idea, I even said, when in 2023, when Ukraine was doing its offensive, which I knew was doomed from the beginning, I said, you know what, if the U.S. and our NATO forces were conducting the same operation, I don't know that we could dent this line here. Even if we had air power, we could have had some success, but the cost would have been enormous because of the multi-layer belts that Russia had developed here would work on a peer-on-peer offensive. If anyone in the West has this delusion that in 14 days with 60,000 troops, they could do what the Ukraine side with somewhere around 200,000 or 300,000 couldn't do in 6 months, is delusional and dangerous.
Well, I'll tell you a wonderful piece of propaganda. So if we go back to February 2022, just before Russia invaded Ukraine, so the Russian troops are all on the border of Ukraine, and there's a big drumbeat. Will Russia go in? Will Russia not go in? I actually didn't think they would go in, but they did. So big drumbeat. So it's on all the radio. The troops are on the border. So on BBC Radio 2, a daytime presenter, very popular, is a very nice, warm, cuddly presenter. Jeremy Vine is somebody that you'd have a cup of tea with and talk to, and he'd be really interesting. He's a nice guy. So he was on there. He was obviously anti-Russian, and he had a spokesman in there from the Royal Air Force, and he was saying that can't we just take out all these Russian soldiers before they go in? And then he asked, how long would it take for the Royal Air Force to take out all of the soldiers, the Russian soldiers that are on the border of Ukraine, to stop them going in? And they said they could do that in a number of hours by bombing them. And he said, well, why don't we do that? And the Royal Air Force says, we follow instructions, etc. Now, I'm sure that's absolutely true. I don't believe the RAF guy was lying, but it makes the assumption that the RAF dropped bombs on these soldiers and there's no return fire. There's no Russian Air Force. It's nonsense. So, but you can see how it was scripted. Britain's so strong, we could have taken out this army in a few hours. It's just nonsense. But people believe it because you stop thinking. You hear a BBC radio presenter present what he believes are the facts. You hear a military official present what he believes are the facts. Well, what else? Why would you and I need to question that? We've heard it from a trusted source, the BBC, and we've heard it from the RAF. It's just complete nonsense. It's just propaganda. But it works.
That is frightening. And I'll tell you why that's frightening is because when you add that mentality in the UK with what I've already talked about here that's in the US and all of these, big names and even in many of the countries in Europe where they're still talking this stuff, when the expected happens, it could come in a month from now, it might come in a year and a half from now. I don't know how long Ukraine, it's always more art than science to know when someone's going to collapse because it's so many factors, but it will happen sometime because the fundamentals will impose themselves just like it did in Afghanistan. And the question's going to come when reality imposes its stuff and exposes all of this as nonsense. What are we going to do then? I mean, people's heads are going to explode when they can't spin this away because now that you have the rubble of a foreign army and you have Russians basically giving surrender terms to Kiev because that's all that will be left at that point. And I worry about the risk of Western countries escalating, not Russian in that case.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, if anyone escalates, it will be us. Russia's in a strong position. It's winning. I mean, although we're told the opposite, why would they need to escalate it? We need to save face and show that all of the lies that we've told, all the propaganda that we've espoused is true.
Because just imagine this, Ian. All with this whole narrative we built the whole time is that Putin is evil. He's vicious. I've had on our show here sometimes with some of the clips of American leaders that love to use that phrase. He's evil, etc. You can't negotiate with evil. That's why we don't want to negotiate now. But what happens when evil wins and you're just going to go home? I mean, you see, well, there will be enormous pressure on so many Western leaders to back up the original evil rhetoric that, oh my God, we can't allow evil to succeed. So we have to go to war. And I mean, it will be a dangerous, dangerous hour for the world at that point.
Absolutely. I mean, as I said, I'm not a military man whatsoever. But every war, whatever that war was, it ended with a ceasefire, peace talks, and some negotiated settlement. Why would the Ukraine-Russia conflict be any different? Why would this not end with a ceasefire, peace talks, and a negotiated settlement? Obviously, with the negotiated settlement, Ukraine's not going to be in the strongest position to negotiate all the things that it would want. And then that begs the $1 million question, is how many more of their young people and old people now, older people are being put to the front line, to the meat grinder. How many more people does it want to sacrifice to get the outcome that it wants? Because it's not going to get the full outcome that it wants, sadly. So how many lives? I mean, it's just insane. It's just insane.
That's where it is right now, and we're gonna continue to monitor this. Ian, I cannot tell you how delighted we've been to have you on today to give us some of these observations. Terrific conversation today. So
I'm going to get George Galloway on your show.
I'm looking forward to that day. We really hope that we can make that happen. It'd be an absolute thrill for us to have George on the show.
He will come on.
Look forward to it that day. And we thank you for joining us today. Even though that some of these are pretty scary things here, we're going to make sure that you're aware and you're tracking about, where things are going and what's happening under the headlines. And when you hear things on mainstream media, we give you the real story underneath. So, on the ground, the realities, regardless of how it's spun, because we are, after all, unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the information you need. And we're going to do that more this afternoon. We showed you a little bit there about Senator Graham being in Ukraine. Well, he is basically urging the Ukrainians to continue sending their young men to slaughter. We'll have that this afternoon. Let's see. I'm not sure what time that's going to be. I can't think that's 2:00. But then check on our schedule there, because you'll see it on the channel. And then General Milley, or former General Milley, will be testifying on the Afghanistan withdrawal before Congress, which starts at 1:00 this afternoon. We will be giving you some probably real-time updates on that as soon as he's finished, or even maybe before it's even completely done. And I have a bad feeling that what you're going to see is basically them trying to say, hey, this was all somebody else's fault. It wasn't my fault. I didn't do anything wrong, even though he and some of these others were the actual architects of why that war failed. We're going to, like we always do, we're holding people's feet to the fire so that you know the truth. Thanks. Be sure to like and subscribe and share this with your friends, and come back and join us this afternoon. And we'll see you then on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.